Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if knowing more words actually helps you learn grammar better, or if it is just about how many words you've heard today? We're diving into a fascinating study that explores this exact question. This paper asks a really fundamental question about how we learn language. We all know that learning new words is crucial for communicating. Think about when a new word pops up, like say to Skype for video calls. We instantly know how to use it in a sentence, right? I am Skyping with a friend. This ability to take a new word and use it correctly in different sentences is called grammatical generalization. It is a super important part of becoming a competent language user. But how exactly does this happen? Researchers have been looking at something called statistical learning, which is basically our brain's ability to pick up on patterns in the language we hear, even without being explicitly taught. They've noticed that words in the same grammatical category, like nouns or verbs, often share similar patterns, like how they sound or how they appear with other words. This paper dives deep into the relationship between knowing words and understanding grammar. The study's big idea is to look at vocabulary knowledge in two different ways. First, how many words are actually in the language we're learning to practice with? And second, how many words have we personally learned and understood? They created a special made-up language with rules, kind of like grammar, and tested adults and kids to see how they learned and then used these rules on new words. So, what did they do? They set up a couple of experiments using an artificial language. This language had a bit of everything. It had sounds that often went together. It had specific word parts that signaled certain meanings. And it had a bit of semantic meaning too, like associating certain words with animals or objects. It was designed to mimic how natural languages work, with grammatical gender systems as a sort of model. In experiment 1, they focused on the language input. They took this made-up language and created two versions. One had a lot of different words, a large vocabulary in the input, and the other had fewer words, a smaller vocabulary in the input. They then had adults and children learn this language and tested how well they could apply its grammatical rules to new, never before seen words. They really wanted to see if more words in the practice language would help people learn the grammar better. They used a specific way to measure grammar learning called an A metric. Think of it like a score that tells us if someone is better at picking the correct new word that follows the rules than if they were just guessing. An A score above 0.5 means they're doing better than chance. Now, what did they find in experiment 1? Here is where it gets interesting. They discovered that having more words in the practice language didn't actually make a difference in how well people learned the grammar rules. This applied to both adults and children. While adults were generally better at all kinds of learning and generalization than children, the number of words they were exposed to didn't boost their grammar skills. This was a bit of a surprise, going against what some previous studies had suggested. This finding meant they had to rethink how vocabulary might affect grammar learning. This brought them to experiment 2, which focused on the learner's vocabulary knowledge, not just the input. In experiment 2, they kept the amount of vocabulary in the practice language, the same as in experiment 1, the larger version. But this time, they changed how the adults learned. They used the criterion learning method. This basically means they kept training the adults on the language until their vocabulary knowledge reached a specific level, specifically the level of knowledge that the children had shown in experiment 1. The idea was to see if having less vocabulary knowledge, even if you are an adult, would hurt your grammar learning. So, what happened in experiment 2? This is where the core of the paper's title really shines. They found that when they reduced the adults' vocabulary knowledge, their ability to generalize grammatical rules went down too. And crucially, their performance became very similar to that of the children from experiment 1 who had lower vocabulary knowledge and poorer generalization. This is a super important finding. It suggests that it is not just about how much language you are exposed to, but more about how much of that language you've actually internalized your own vocabulary knowledge. This supports a theory called the lexicalist approach to language development, which says that you need a certain critical mass of vocabulary before you can really start generalizing grammar rules. The study also looked at whether people knew they were learning the rules, which they call explicit knowledge. They found that adults who became aware of the language rules tended to generalize them better. This wasn't the case for children, suggesting that maybe different learning processes are at play depending on your age and how vocabulary knowledge develops. So, what does all this mean for us? It really highlights the interconnectedness of vocabulary and grammar. It is like building blocks. You need a solid foundation of words before you can build complex grammatical structures. The size of the language input itself doesn't seem to be the most crucial factor, but rather the depth of your own vocabulary. This is a great reminder that building a rich vocabulary is essential for learning and using language effectively, both for kids and adults. Now, for a critical look, the study used an artificial language, which is great for controlling variables, but it is not exactly real-life conversation. Also, measuring explicit knowledge through verbal reports might be tricky, especially for younger children. Future research could explore this in more natural language settings, or with even more sensitive ways to measure what people consciously know about the rules. In conclusion, this research gives us a clearer picture of how vocabulary knowledge fuels grammar learning. It is a strong argument for the importance of building a solid vocabulary, not just for knowing more words, but for unlocking the deeper structures of language. It really emphasizes how our internal word knowledge is the engine that drives grammatical mastery. What do you think about these findings? Does this explanation of vocabulary and grammar learning make sense to you? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research. We'll see you next time.